Hello everyone, today I wanted to make a quick video about the conditional reasoning of the LSAT test. Today we're going to assume a basic linear one-to-one model because this is a basic one, so I think you should start here, and then once you understand this concept, you can move on to a more complex scenarios. I'm sure you have heard the word sufficient and necessary multiple times. These are the main concept in the LSAT test. The way I like to think about it is to actually draw a diagram. So if you had a small circle, which was within the big circle, this circle would be sufficient. And that bigger circle would be necessary. So if you were to say something is sufficient, x here, this x also has to be necessary because sufficient is part of the bigger circle, which is necessary. But if you had the x here, and if you were to say if something is necessary, that does not mean it's sufficient. So if something is sufficient, that thing is always necessary. If something is necessary, that does not mean it's sufficient. Now, if we were to apply this table to this question, we can see that the first word says if, and we know from here, if is a sufficient word. The way we're going to draw this is to write the sufficient word first and then the necessary. So we know Tim arriving on the second day is sufficient, so we're going to make it shorter. So Tim arriving on the second day means that Nicole, don't mix up the ends, here Nicole, does not arrive on the fourth day. Now let's say if we were to look at the opposite of this formula. So if this formula was written like this, if we were to reverse it, how would we write it? So if we know Nicole is actually in fact working on the fourth day, or arriving on the fourth day, then we know Tim cannot be arriving on the second day. So if we go back, we know for something to be sufficient, it has to be part of the necessary. But for something to be necessary, it does not mean it is sufficient. Now let's go with the second question. Now moving on to the second question, we can see that we have a word unless. And if you look at our table, unless is part of a necessary condition. So we know this part is necessary, and the part before that is sufficient. Again, if we were to draw that in our diagram, it would be Matt does not work on Fridays unless Andy works on Tuesday. So if Matt is working on Fridays, it means that Andy works on Tuesdays. Again, this is perfect. Because we have the unless, we're not focusing on does not work. We're trying to make this as a positive thing. So if he's working, then Andy works on Tuesdays. Now, if we were to do it on the opposite, where the necessary is forward, so if we say Andy did not work on Tuesdays, that means Matt does not also work on Fridays. So if we had our big circle with necessary and the small circle sufficient, when we say when something is not necessary, it means it does not contain this sufficient part, this smaller circle. So Matt, who would be here, cannot be here. Matt is probably somewhere there. Now that we understand it, let's move on to a different question. Now moving on to the third question. We have the word if, and previously we know from previous question and from this table, we know that if is a sufficient condition. So we know if Dennis jumps earlier than Sarah, a lot of the textbooks tells you this is how you should be drawing it. This means that Dennis is, whatever Dennis's action is, it's going to happen earlier than Sarah. And this represents that we don't know how far the distance between them are. So we know that if Dennis jumps earlier than Sarah, and this is our sufficient, then Tom jumps earlier than Muhammad. Again, we don't know how early, we just know it's earlier. And this becomes our diagram. Now again, if we were to reverse it, then we know if Tom does not jump earlier than Muhammad, this means that Dennis won't be jumping earlier than Sarah either. Again, if you remember our big circle and little circle, so if the bigger circle is not happening, then sufficient is also not happening. Now moving on to the fourth question. Julie performs fifth only if, now this time you have to be careful. There is an if, but it's also, you have to read the entire thing, which is only if. And only if becomes necessary, whereas if alone is sufficient. So Julie performs fifth, sufficient and necessary. Julie performing fifth only if Paul performs second. So that is our diagram. If we were to reverse that, where we have the necessary, then we would say if Paul didn't perform second, then Julie will also not be performing on the fifth. Okay, now moving on to question 5. Bob runs immediately before Sydney if sufficient. Bob runs immediately. This time we know when the location is, so Bob is before Sydney. If, meaning this is our sufficient. If Hannah runs immediately after Sydney. So this is an interesting one because we can see that Sydney is part of the sufficient group as well as the necessary group. And we said that if sufficient is happening, necessary is definitely happening. So if this is true, we can actually write it like this. If Bob runs immediately before Sydney, and we know our necessary condition is that Hannah runs immediately after Sydney, we know based on our sufficient that Sydney is running after Bob. So we know Bob is somewhere here. But if we were to write it backward, we can't write that because we can't go from a necessary to sufficient. Again, if it's here, we know it's necessary, but we don't know if it's sufficient. So we can't write it when we're going in reverse. We know that necessary to sufficient. We know that Hannah runs immediately after Sydney. So if this doesn't happen, we know that Bob does not also runs immediately before Sydney. So this one is really good because it gives you another information. So the last question says, Haley cannot swim until Lindsay is swum. So Haley cannot swim, but we have the word unless, so we're just gonna ignore the negative. Haley is going to swim until Lindsay is swum. Unless Lindsay swam second. So this is our sufficient to necessary. And if we were to write it backward, we know if Lindsay does not swim on the second, then Haley won't be swimming till before Lindsay. And because there are either two ways, it can either be Haley before Lindsay, or it can be Haley after Lindsay. So if you already know Haley cannot be before Lindsay, so this must mean that Lindsay is going to be before Haley. This is another extra information that we can conduct from further analyzing these diagrams. I hope that helps, and if you have any questions, please feel free to comment below and I can clarify anything. If you have other questions that you want me to look for, just send me a message and I'll take a look. Thank you for watching.